In the second lecture, I will be speaking on the development of the European integration after the Cold War. Particularly, I will be focused on Maastricht Treaty, changes it brought to the European community structure, decision-making and integration in the field of common foreign and security policy. This lecture deals with the process that led to Maastricht, the three pillars of the European Union, the institutional structures with some conclusions of the achievement and legacy of the Maastricht Treaty. Let's start with the road to Maastricht. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the fall of communism, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, and the end of the East-West confrontation marked a new era in the development of international relations. The defeat of the ideology of communism led to the democratic development of societies, the transition to a multi-party political systems, the emphasis on the individual right to freedom of speech, opinion, religion, and ethnicity. At that time, Europe was facing new challenges related to the issue of borders and future expansion, the scope of the integration process, the unification of Germany, and the transformation of relations of the European-US line. Despite the existing disagreements over the character of the community, the actors turned to the process of strengthening European integration and the creation of a union of states, which includes the victory of supranational currents and the strengthening of supranational powers. However, the question of the extent and scope of integration itself remained open. In parallel with the negotiations on the creation of the European Economic and Monetary Union, the creation of a common foreign and security policy was increasingly considered. In January of 1991, Luxembourg submitted a proposal to the so-called the three pillars of which the European Union should be based on. The first pillar should be the institutions established by the Treaties of Rome with the already outlined relationships of supranational and intergovernmental action. The most important bodies of the first pillar are the Commission and the European Parliament. To this pillar were added the emerging economic and monetary unions. The second pillar comprises a common foreign and security policy with a greater degree of intergovernmental decision-making. The main bodies would be the European Council and the Council of Ministers. And the third pillar, which concerns international affairs and the judiciary, assuming a high degree of coordination between member states. After years of efforts, turmoil, negotiations, and creation of the future prospect of European unification, the heads of the EU member states met in Maastricht in December of 1991, where another reform of the Treaties of Rome was agreed, and the European Union Treaty was signed on 7th of February in 1992. Finally, it entered into force on 1st of November of 1993. Despite an agreement between the heads of state and government, the decision to move with a single currency has caused concern among member states. In Germany, for example, there has been a sharp decline in support for the idea of European Monetary Union and thus for the Maastricht Treaty itself. Floating European economies have entered a period of recession, which has particularly affected citizens' support for the emerging European project. In April of 1992, the European Parliament passed a resolution calling on 12 member states to ratify the Maastricht Treaty, which proved to be no easy task. Prior to ratification, 3 countries held national referendum: Denmark, Ireland, and France. 50.7% of Danes rejected the treaty for fear of future defense solutions, standardization of immigration policy, and the idea of European citizenship. The Irish accepted the treaty by a majority of 69% of the vote. The 11 rejected the Danish proposal to redefine and negotiate the disputed parts of the treaty. The French went to the referendum in September of 1992 and approved the acceptance of the treaty with a close 51.45%. In Germany, concerns continued to grow, prompting the Bundestag to decide on the right to revote before automatically abandoning the Deutschmark in favor of the European currency. With this move, Germany was indirectly given the rights that both Denmark and the United Kingdom received in terms of the possibility of withdrawal. From a predominantly economically integrating institutions based on political cooperation, the community continues to develop further into the Union, which by the new Maastricht Treaty includes the common foreign and security policy and cooperation in the field of international affairs and justice. It is these three areas of cooperation that remain within the competence of the member states, even though they are formally included in the structural framework of the Union. The preamble of the treaty states that it represents a new phase in the development of a closer union among the peoples of Europe and is based on the European communities whose treaties are complemented by policies and forms of cooperation. The Union should meet the following objectives. First, to promote economic and social progress, in particular by creating an area without internal borders, strengthening economic and social cohesion, and establishing an economic and monetary union that would lead to a single currency. Then, to strengthen its identity on the international stage, in particular by implementing a common foreign and security policy, including a possible framework for a common defense policy that could eventually lead to the creation of a common defense. And lastly, to strengthen the protection of the rights and interests of nationals of the member states by introducing citizenship of the Union. Also, the aim was to develop close cooperations in the field of justice and home affairs. According to the Article C, the Union should fully ensure the consistency of its external actions in the context of foreign policy, security, economics, and development policies, for which the European Council should be responsible. Article D of the Part 1 of the Treaty states that the European Council should provide additional impetus to the development of the Union by defining general guidelines for development. The European Council will meet at least twice a year and will bring together heads of states and government, the President of the Commission, joined by the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and the Member States, and also members of the Commission. The European Council will submit a report to the European Parliament after each meeting, as well as an annual report on the progress made within the Union. The European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, the Commission, and the Court of Justice will perform their duties in accordance with the provisions of the treaty, establishing the European communities and other treaties modifying them. Now I will be speaking about the institutions of the newly created Union. Chapter E of the Maastricht Treaty sets out amendments to the European Economic Community Treaty relating to the competencies and operation of the community institutions. The following provisions contribute to strengthening the elements of political integration as well as democracy. First, Parliament may request the Commission to prepare certain proposals wherever necessary in the performance of its treaty obligations. Then, Parliament may, at the request of a quarter of its members, initiate a parliamentary inquiry into suspected abuses of breaches of jurisdiction if it is not already decided by the court. The investigations would be led by an interim research committee whose mandate ends within the submission of a report. Then, the European Parliament receives petitions from citizens of the Union and from these persons residing in the territory of the Union on community action affecting them personally. The Council of Ministers will be composed of representatives of the Member States at the ministerial level, which brings a change in the European Economic Community Treaty, where only representatives of Member States are listed. The European Union Treaty seeks to distinguish as precisely as possible the functions of an operational nature within the competencies of the Council held by ministers of individual member states and functions of a strategic nature within the competencies of the European Council, whose holders are the highest representatives of government. Now I will explain the decision-making process. The European Union Treaty brings about changes in the competencies and strengthens the role of the European Parliament, which should be actively involved in the adoption of acts within the competence of the Council of Ministers. The European Parliament may, within 3 months of the adoption of the common positions of the Council of Ministers, do the following: to approve a common position, followed by the formal adoption of acts within the Council, not make a decision, after which the Council adopts the act, and propose amendments to the common position on which the Council and the Commission give their opinion. The second pillar of the European Union, according to the Maastricht Treaty, is the common foreign and security policy, which introduces a dimension more in the process of European integration and whose goals are: first, the protection of the common values, fundamental interest and independence of the Union. Second, strengthening the security of the Union and its member states. Third, the preservation of peace and the strengthening of international security in accordance with the principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of Helsinki Final Act, and also with the objectives of the Paris Charter. Then, to promote international cooperation, and finally, to develop the democracy and the rule of law, respect for human rights and freedoms. According to the Treaty of the European Union, the Western European Union should be a forum for elaborating and discussing all security issues concerning the European Union's defense policy. Thus, the Western European Union became a defense component of the European Union. However, the EU's commitment to establishing the concept of common foreign and security policy at that time was not yet followed by the formation of concrete joint European Union defense forces for its implementation. With the Maastricht Treaty, the members of the Western European Union adopted measures for cooperation with both the European Union and NATO, and it represents a sort of compromise between Europeans and NATO, not only regarding the future of the Western European Union, but the entire European security policy. Such formulations reach a compromise between the demands of Germany and France for the Western European Union to become a defense organization of the European Union with joint military forces and the oppositions of the Great Britain and Netherlands, who believe that any separation of forces, regardless of whether they were still formally part of NATO, would mean capacity duplication and thus the weakening of the Western alliance. In Maastricht, Europeans actually set out to shape their post-Cold War destiny, and although nothing concrete has been agreed on defense, the very indication of the possibility of a joint European dialogue on defense and European foreign policy presents a big step in Europe's integration. The provisions of the creation of common foreign policy have not been fully elaborated in order to put a loop of equality with the economic aspect of the association. We find confirmation in point 2 of Article J3 of the European Union Treaty, which states that the Council decides by a qualified majority only on procedural issues, while the guidelines and basic principles formulated by the European Council in the field of foreign and security policy are adopted unanimously. As part of the creation of the European Union, Europeans gave priority to the foreign policy aspect of their actions over the security component. In its gradual attempts to act as an international supranational organization, the European Union is primarily developing the concept of a common foreign and security policy, then the concept of a common foreign and political identity, and lastly, a common security and defense identity. A major step in strengthening European defense is the Petersburg Declaration, which defines the tasks of the Western European Union in the form of participation in humanitarian and other rescue operations, peacekeeping operations, as well as the use of military forces in crisis management to establish peace. In this way, the European Union expressed its determination to participate in creating global security and also to tackle challenges of the so-called soft security, of course, while maintaining the role of NATO as the main mechanism of collective defense. The indecision of Europeans in the field of security, along with the fear of losing part of their national sovereignty, was also reflected in the lack of a single security and defense identity. The United States soon saw the need to develop a European security and defense policy, take greater responsibility for European security, and detect the Western European Union as a gathering place for the European security architecture and European defense forces within NATO. In this regard, the then US Secretary of Defense, Les Aspin, proposed in 1993 the establishment of a new force within the alliance, which was the Combined Joint Task Force. NATO foreign ministers then met in Berlin in June of 1996, where forces were formally established. At that time, the European Union still lacked the determination to institutionalize European defense cooperation, and the Western European Union represented a sort of security link between NATO and the European Union. However, under increasing pressure, the European Union began to gradually weaken the Western Europeans' role in European security issues, and in a document entitled Agenda 2000, adopted in 1997, member states decided, in addition to political and monetary union, to establish the common security and defense policy and also forces for its implementation. Britain's turn to Europe on security issues, conditioned by the US stance on Europeans' preoccupation with defense integration process, led to the Anglo-French meeting in Saint-Malo in 1998, which concluded that all future decisions on European security and defense identity must be linked to the European Union and no longer to the Western European Union. Thus, Europe was given the opportunity to take autonomous military actions when the alliance as a whole was not interested. The declaration of the Cologne meeting states that the Western European Union, as a security organization, has actually fulfilled its tasks and that the European Union must take over its functions in order to be able to meet the Petersburg goals. Also, a new term, the European Policy on Security and Defense, was adopted. At the European Union Summit in Helsinki in 1999, a decision was made to form a European Rapid Intervention Force that would number 50,000 to 60,000 troops, and their operations would be organized and led by the European Union. This was then followed by steps to further manage these mentioned forces and their cooperation within the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance. The Political and Security Committee was also established as a permanent working body of the European Union, which would include representatives of member states at their ambassadorial level, and the Military Committee, which brought together defense ministers of member states. Now I will be speaking on the cooperations in the field of justice and home affairs. The third mentioned pillar of the structure of the European Union is actually cooperation in field of justice and home affairs. In accordance with the Maastricht Treaty, member states should act in areas of common interest, which include asylum policy, rules relating to the crossings of the external borders of the member states, immigration policy and policy towards members of third countries, fight against drugs and international crime, cooperation of judicial bodies in civil and criminal matters, cooperation in the field of customs, and police cooperation aimed at preventing and combating terrorism, illicit drug distribution, and other forms of international crime. The second and third pillars of the European Union are linked together by a single institutional mechanism and intergovernmental decision-making. Also, in the framework of cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs, the Commission is left with a limited role initiative, the Parliament with an advisory and informative role, while the jurisdiction of the Court is in principle excluded. I will now explain the institutional structure of the European Union. The European Union does not have a formal constitution, but several treaties govern and determine its operation. Everyone is familiar with the three founding treaties, the Treaty of Paris and the two treaties of Rome, which are supplemented by the provisions of three treaties that affect the power on institutions. These are the treaty establishing a single council and commission, known as the Merger Treaty, which was signed in 1965 and entered into force 2 years later, while the other two are related to budgetary issues. After 1975, there were no further revisions of the treaties for a decade when 3 new treaties were concluded: the 1985 Single European Act, the Treaty on European Union, which entered into the force in 1993, and the 1997 Treaty of Amsterdam. The claim that the European Union has replaced the European communities is actually incorrect. On the contrary, it has incorporated 3 communities into a broader structure. According to the above, it is logical and correct to talk about the law of the European community, taking into account the fact that only within the first pillar is actually law created. The other 2 pillars represent intergovernmental cooperation. The Amsterdam Treaty modified the Maastricht architecture in several ways. Asylum, immigration, and third pillar visa policies were moved to the first, while the third pillar was renamed Police and Judicial Cooperation in Criminal Matters. The Commission is responsible for submitting proposals to the Council when passing legislations, and also proposes the draft annual budget of the Union for discussion in the Council of Ministers and the Parliament. It is very important to mention that under the second and third pillars, the Commission, Parliament and the Court do not have the same powers as in the first pillar. In practice, the Commission consults with stakeholders, committees of technical experts, as well as with representatives of national bureaucracy when submitting proposals. Although the Commission and Parliament worked very closely together to reduce the influence of national governments, the Commission strongly opposed Parliament's demands to be given the opportunity to initiate legal proposals. It is the Commission's monopoly on the right of the initiatives that enables the realization of the work of the European community as a whole. This was also the reason for the Commission's opposition to cooperation in the field of common and foreign policy, and also to justice and home affairs outside the European Community decision-making framework, which ultimately did not bear any fruit. The Councils of Ministers is made up of the representatives of member states, and most meetings do not take place at ministerial but at the level of committees of national government officials. Almost all work related to ministerial meetings take place is filtered through the mentioned committees and later to the Committee of Permanent Representatives, which consists of ambassadors of the member states to the European Union. The Council acts on a proposal from the Commission either by unanimity or by qualified majority. The Amsterdam Treaty expanded majority voting to equal pay and treatment for women and men, framework programs for research and development, access to official documents, the fight against fraud, and the cooperation in the field of customs. In the original draft of the European Coal and Steel Community, Monnet did not include a parliamentary body, which was soon corrected in an effort to create a more democratic community. The European Parliament has constantly sought to be more actively involved in the decision-making process, especially after 1979, when it became a directly elected body. However, progress has been very limited. In the original legislative process, the Council of Ministers was required to consult Parliament before receiving legislative proposals from the Commission, but it could have been ignored, as is the case in several policy areas. In some other areas, Parliament has the right to block legislation. When adopting the annual budget, Parliament is the co-decision maker with the Council. The Economic and Social Council is made of representatives of different economic and social interests. The Commission and the Council must consult on various issues, including agriculture, freedom of movement for workers, social policy, and the internal market, measures of economic and social cohesion, and the environment. In practice, the Economic and Social Council is not particularly influential. The Committee of the Regions and Local Authorities was formed by the European Union Treaty, which gave it the right to be consulted on proposals that have implications for regional and local interests, as well as the right to give an own initiative opinion. It differs from the Economic and Social Council in that it enjoys considerable support from highly influential political actors. It is expected to play a significant role in the future. The Commission therefore seeks to work closely with the Committee and to support its long-standing efforts to create a Europe of regions that would weaken the influence on national governments in the decision-making. As already mentioned, the Treaty of the European Union introduced two new areas of cooperation. The common foreign and security policy presents a revival of the existing European cooperation in the field of foreign policy, while cooperation in the field of justice and home affairs is completely new in the treaty. The reason why these two areas of cooperation have not been put under the umbrella of the European Community actually lies in the fact that the member states were not ready to give up control in such an important areas of national policy. To conclude, what are the achievements of the Maastricht Treaty and the character of the new created European Union? The Maastricht Summit was special in many ways. The Cold War ended, Austria applied for membership, and within the European Economic Community, there was a debate between proponents of widening, led by the United Kingdoms, and member states advocated deepening of the Union in the direction of federalism, led by France and Germany. The Treaty of the European Union marks the symbolic beginning of a new chapter in the development of European cooperation. However, its ratification in the member states has actually shown that the picture on the ground is not so idyllic. Denmark's no in the referendum could have jeopardized important reforms that were actually an integral part of the treaty. Britain was very hesitant to accept it, while in France the referendum passed by a narrow majority. In practice, it has been shown that the public of the sum of member states was not convinced at the initial stage in favor of the whole process and was not ready to give up some of the national symbols for the purpose of unification. Soon, in line with economic development, a decision was made on an individual approach in the form of respect for degrees and speeds, which at the end allowed each country to join the integration process when economic indicators allow. The Maastricht Treaty also paved the way for the introduction of a single European currency, which is by far the most significant step of the entire integration process, a step marked by supranationalism. After the creation of the European Union, there are renewed debates between federalists who believe that the integration process has slowed down and that supranational solutions should be sought in order to achieve the maximum effect of integration in the form of reducing the role of nation-states and giving greater powers to the Parliament. During the presidencies of Italy and the Netherlands, the proposals for the creation of a federal union were particularly strong. The head of socialists in the European Parliament, Jean-Pierre Cot, proposed several solutions to strengthen democratic control within the community. The right of co-decision between Parliament and Councils of Ministers, improved cooperation between national parliaments and the European Parliament, and open meetings of the Councils of Ministers. Institutional reforms were also proposed. The Council and the Commission were to receive assistance from two new bodies, the Economic and Social Council and the Council of the Regions, which would be of an advisory nature. In practice, the Parliament was a consultative body with an ombudsman to whom citizens could report irregularities in the work of community institutions, excluding the Court of Justice. The original treaty establishing the European communities did not mention a common foreign and security policy. Maastricht proposed the definition and implementation of common foreign and security policy, including the definition of a common defense policy that would at the end lead to a common defense. The Western European Union has been designated as the body that will be the main body in the future in the implementation of community guidelines related to the defense. Several concrete changes and proposals were related to economic integration. The monetary union, which was planned to be implemented in 3 stages, was to focus on 3 institutions: the European System of Central Banks, the European Central Bank, and the European Investment Bank. The Maastricht Treaty can be viewed as a compromise that avoids the word on F, meaning federation, when it comes to political union. Overall, faced with British fears of losing sovereignty, France and Germany turned to monetary union as a means of promoting European integration. The Maastricht Treaty left many things unsaid. Criticism of the European political union formulated by the treaty goes in the direction of questioning of the legitimacy of the institutions of community. Monnet concluded in his memoirs that the words that people are discussing, federation or confederations, are inappropriate and imprecise because direction in which the community is developing is probably unprecedented. There was also division among European community members over the meaning of federalism and the distribution of power in the federal system. Germany, then the only federation within the European community, equated federalism with the decentralization of power, while the British perceived federalism as a synonym for the increased concentration of power in Brussels. Europeanism should strive to spread the values of liberalism, pluralism, tolerance, rationality, and to strengthen cultural and linguistic differences. Article 128 of the Maastricht Treaty states that the community will contribute to the flowering of the cultures of the member states while respecting national and regional differences, also working towards the creation of a common cultural heritage. National diversity was planned to be maintained. With this said, I finished the second lecture, which was mostly focused on the aims and consequences of the Maastricht Treaty brought to the European integration project. As planned, the significance of the Maastricht Treaty for the European integration process was fully presented. The Treaty of the European Union marks the symbolic beginning of a new chapter in the development of European cooperation. The third lecture will focus on the attempts to create European constitutions, on discussions surrounding this idea, development of common foreign and security policy, and the solution which was presented in the form of the Reform Treaty.